It includes details on what Betsy Hackman was searching for before she died and the first-person view of the officers.
Cloud of suspicion surrounds the deaths of Oscar-winning actor Gene Hackman and his wife, whose bodies were found in their Santa Fe home. No one had seen the couple for days, and authorities say they had been dead for some time.
When Walter Wren died at his secluded estate outside Taos, New Mexico, the story practically wrote itself before anyone had asked a single hard question. He was 88. He had spent the last 2 decades of his life retreating from the public almost entirely, a once celebrated character actor turned recluse, more rumor than person to the small mountain town that had grown up around the edges of his land. His wife, Adele, had died 11 days earlier. The county coroner attributed her death to a sudden respiratory infection. His own death, when it came, was logged as cardiac arrest, complicated by advanced dementia. Grief, isolation, an old man's failing body, the kind of ending nobody questions because it asks nothing of anyone. For the first 72 hours, that was exactly how it stayed. Closed file. A quiet obituary. A handful of old fans posting photos from films decades out of circulation. Nobody outside the immediate investigating officers gave the property at the end of Cottonwood Pass a second thought, because nothing about it, on the surface, demanded one. That changed when Deputy Marisol Ibarra went back to close out the file. She wasn't looking for anything. She was doing paperwork, confirming time of death against the estate's internal logs, the kind of administrative loose end nobody enjoys and everybody has to finish. The estate had an old analog security system, installed sometime in the 1970s and stubbornly maintained ever since, the kind of setup that recorded entries and exits on a mechanical counter rather than digital timestamps. It was while reconciling that counter against the household's water and power usage that she noticed the gap didn't add up. According to the official timeline, Walter Wren had spent the 11 days between his wife's death and his own essentially immobile, a grieving, declining man alone in a large house, slowly succumbing to the same isolation that had defined his last 20 years. But the water usage said otherwise. Someone or something had been drawing meaningful amounts of water from a line that didn't run to any room in the main house. It ran, according to a yellowed blueprint Ibarra found folded into a filing cabinet nobody had opened in years, toward the old root cellar behind the orchard. She mentioned it to her supervisor, mostly out of habit. He told her to log it and move on. She didn't. Ibarra drove back out to the estate on her own time, on a gray Tuesday with low clouds sitting over the foothills, and let herself in through the service gate using a code that, embarrassingly, nobody had bothered to deactivate. The orchard was overgrown, the kind of neglect that comes from money rather than poverty. Nobody had pruned the apple trees in years, but somebody had been paying a property service to mow around them anyway, like the appearance of care mattered more than the substance of it. The root cellar door was where the blueprint said it would be, half buried under ivy, padlocked with a lock so old the keyway had rusted shut. She didn't have a warrant, and she knew it. She also knew that if she walked away now this would go back into a drawer and stay there. So she called it in as a welfare concern, a technically defensible lie, and waited 40 minutes for a locksmith and 2 more deputies to arrive. What was behind the cellar door wasn't a cellar. It was a narrow stone stairway, descending at a steep pitch into the hillside, lit by a string of bare bulbs that someone had wired decades ago, and that, against all odds, still worked. The air coming up from below was cool and faintly metallic, the way old mine shafts smell, mineral and damp. Ibarra went down first. She would later tell investigators that the strangest part wasn't the staircase itself. Old properties in that part of New Mexico sometimes had root cellars, spring houses, the occasional forgotten mine entrance from the Silver Rush days. It was how clean the steps were. No dust, no cobwebs. Someone had been using these stairs regularly for a very long time. At the bottom, the passage widened into a tunnel reinforced with timber bracing that looked, to her untrained eye, both very old and very deliberately maintained. Cables ran along the ceiling, newer than the timber, feeding power down from somewhere above. And about 60 feet in, the tunnel opened into a room that none of the 3 deputies present that day were prepared to explain in their incident reports. The state ended up bringing in a small forensic and structural team rather than handing the whole thing to the FBI, which in itself tells you something about how seriously anyone initially took it. A structural engineer named Priya Daswani was the first specialist on scene, and her assessment, delivered calmly into a voice recorder, became the first official document anyone wrote about the chamber. The upper third of this tunnel is reinforced with materials and methods consistent with mid-century private construction, Somebody with money and a contractor willing to keep their mouth shut sometime around the 1950s or 60s will be my guess pending dating analysis, she said. But the lower section is different. The stonework down here predates the timber bracing by a significant margin. I'm not a geologist, but if you're asking me whether a person built this space from scratch in the 20th century, my answer is no. Somebody found it, and then somebody built around it. The room itself was modest, maybe 20 feet across, walls of rough native stone. It contained, among other things, a hand-crank ventilation fan that still worked, several wooden shelves stacked with mason jars of preserved food going back, based on the canning dates stamped into the lids, at least 15 years, and a small cot with a folded wool blanket neatly made, as though whoever last used it had expected to return. Against the far wall was a door. Not a modern vault door, nothing dramatic. A heavy wooden door reinforced with iron strapping, the kind of person might have installed on a root cellar or a storm shelter 100 years ago. Except this one had been fitted, sometime more recently, with 3 separate mechanical bolts that required a person to physically throw each one by hand. There was no electronic component to any of it. No keypad, no sensor. Just iron wood and the kind of deliberate, old-fashioned engineering that exists specifically because it cannot be hacked, remotely triggered, or defeated by a power outage. The bolts were thrown. The door was locked from the chamber side, meaning whoever had last used that room had locked the door and then climbed back up the stairs, rather than the reverse. What was on the other side of it? Nobody on that first team opened. Not because of any classified order, not because of some shadowy authority swooping in, but because Daswani, looking at the door's age and condition, made the entirely reasonable recommendation that they bring in someone qualified to assess whether the space behind it was structurally stable before anyone went poking around inside an old mine shaft that might, for all anyone knew, simply collapse. It was the second visit, 4 days later, that produced the detail that actually changed how investigators understood Walter Wren's final days. A forensic technician named Carlo Strowski was assigned to process the chamber for trace evidence, mostly as a formality, confirming the space had been used, dating that use, ruling out any indication that Adele Wren's death had been anything other than what the coroner said it was. It was Ostrowski who noticed that the dust pattern on the floor told a story the official timeline didn't account for. There were 2 distinct sets of footprints in the fine sediment that had settled across the chamber floor over the years. One older, consistent with years of repeated, casual use, and one much fresher, made by someone wearing soft-soled house slippers rather than boots. The fresh prints led from the bottom of the stairs, across the chamber, to the cot, and back. They did not notably approach the iron door. Ostrowski cross-referenced the freshness of those prints against humidity data logged by a small thermometer hygrometer someone had mounted on the chamber wall years earlier, the kind of cheap device you buy to monitor a wine cellar. The device had been quietly, faithfully recording temperature and humidity in that chamber for over a decade, and the most recent readings, the very last entries before the device's battery finally died, were dated to 2 days before Walter Wren's own death, 3 days after his wife's. What that tells us, Ostrowski said in his report, is that sometime in the week between his wife's death and his own, in the advanced stages of a cardiac and cognitive decline that should have made stairs alone a serious risk, Walter Wren made his way down 60 feet of stone steps, sat in that chamber for some period of time, and made his way back up. More than once, based on the wear pattern. He wasn't running from anything. He wasn't disoriented. The prints are deliberate, measured, the kind you get from someone who knew exactly where they were going and exactly how to get there. It was a strange, sad detail, more than a sinister one, at least at first. Investigators speculated that Wren, isolated and grieving, had simply retreated to a space that meant something to him, maybe a place he and his late wife had used together, a private refuge from a life that had become almost entirely private refuge anyway. It was the kind of explanation that made emotional sense and required nothing further. What complicated that explanation was the door. A regional historical society, contacted almost as an afterthought by the county to help identify the provenance of the chamber, turned up something the investigators hadn't expected: deed records, partial and fragmentary, suggesting the land had originally been part of a much larger mining claim dating to the 1880s, abandoned after a partial collapse that the era's records described only vaguely as an incident before the claim was sealed and sold off in pieces over the following decades. That was, on its own, a mundane footnote. This part of New Mexico is riddled with old mine shafts, most of them sealed for exactly the reason this one apparently had been: a collapse, real or rumored, that made the workings unsafe or unprofitable to continue. What the Historical Society couldn't explain was why someone, sometime in the mid-20th century, had gone to the trouble of reinforcing the upper tunnel, installing ventilation, and outfitting the lower chamber as something closer to a long-term shelter than an abandoned mine entrance. A retired mining engineer the county brought in as a consultant, a quiet, careful man named Hollis Pratt who'd spent 40 years assessing old workings across the Southwest before retiring to Taos himself, offered the most grounded explanation anyone produced. People build shelters like this for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with conspiracy, he said. Cold War bunkers. Storm shelters. Sometimes a previous owner just liked having a private space nobody else knew about. Eccentric rich people do that more than you'd think. The door with the manual bolts isn't sinister. It's just old. Whoever built it didn't trust electricity, and frankly, given how often the power goes out up here, they weren't wrong not to. As for what was behind the door, Pratt's working theory, and ultimately the one the county settled on, was considerably less dramatic than anyone expected. When a structural team finally did open it, under proper safety protocols, 3 weeks after Wren's death, they found a continuation of the original mine working, a short, naturally narrowing passage that dead-ended in a partial rockfall roughly 30 feet in, consistent with the incident referenced in the old deed records. There was no hidden laboratory, no government conspiracy, no biological anomaly. There was a played-out silver claim that someone, at some point in the last century, had decided to seal off, reinforce, and quietly maintain, first as a wartime shelter, most likely, and later, it seemed, as something more personal. What made the story worth telling wasn't a cover-up. It was Walter Wren himself. A search of the main house turned up a small fireproof box in Wren's study containing letters, photographs, and a journal that filled in the rest of the picture, and it was this material, not classified data, not shadowy federal teams, that actually explained the tunnel. The land had belonged to Wren's grandfather, a hard rock miner who'd worked the original claim before the collapse sealed it for good. The family had held onto the property for decades, mostly as fallow ranch land, until Wren bought back the original homestead acreage in the early 1960s, flush with his first real film money, in what the journal described as an attempt to put something back together that had been broken before I was born. He'd had the upper tunnel reinforced not for any dramatic purpose, but because his grandfather, before he died, had asked him to make sure it didn't collapse further and take the hillside with it. The chamber became, over the following decades, a private retreat, somewhere Wren and Adele went together, away from the industry, away from the cameras, away from everything that came with being a recognizable face in a business that rarely let people simply disappear. The journal's final entries, dated across the week between Adele's death and his own, were not the writings of a man executing a protocol. They were the writings of a man in the specific, disoriented grief of advanced age, returning again and again to the one place that had ever felt entirely his own and entirely safe, sitting in a chair across from a cot where, the letters made clear, his wife had spent her final mornings reading because the chamber was cool and quiet in her lungs. By then, struggled with the dry mountain air above. I went down today, one of the last entries read. I sat where she used to sit. I don't think I can explain to anyone why that helps, only that it does. He had not called anyone, not because he was concealing something, but because his daughter later told investigators he had made his peace, weeks earlier, with the idea that he did not intend to outlive his wife by very long, and had quietly asked that no extraordinary efforts be made to extend either of their lives once the end came for one of them. It was, in the daughter's words, an old man's private grief and a private goodbye, in the one place that had only ever belonged to the two of them. The county closed the file within the month. There was no classification, no national security hold, no convoy of unmarked vehicles in the night, only a brief, almost apologetic note from the sheriff's office to local press explaining that an unusual structural feature on the property had been investigated and found to relate to a pre-existing historical mine working with no bearing on the cause of either death, both of which remained as originally determined. What stayed with Deputy Ibarra, she said later, wasn't the tunnel or the door or any of the details that had, for a few strange days, made the case feel like something out of a thriller. It was the wear pattern on those stone steps, decades of quiet, repeated visits by two people who had found, in an abandoned silver mine beneath their own property, the kind of private refuge that fame and isolation alike had made impossible to find anywhere else. It was the cot, made up neatly, waiting for someone who was never coming back down. It was the last journal entry, written in a shaking hand by a man with nothing left to hide and nowhere left he wanted to be except, for a little while longer, somewhere that still smelled like the woman he'd loved. The tunnel is sealed again now. At the family's request, the iron door rehung and the bolts thrown one final time, this time by Rin's daughter, who said she wanted it left exactly as her father had left it, not as evidence, not as mystery, but as the one room in that enormous, isolating house that had never needed to perform anything for anyone. There was no conspiracy at the bottom of that hillside. There was only an old man, a dying woman, and a hidden room built by people 2 generations apart, each one trying, in their own way, to hold on to something the world outside kept threatening to take from them.